morning, class. I hope you are okay. So, this lesson, we are going to look at the database and database management systems. Now, mostly we'll touch on databases and database management systems. We'll also touch on databases approach versus the traditional approach of collecting and storing data. We shall also look at how to create the database and how to maintain and organize the database. Now, let's start first things first. What do you mean by the term data? And what do we mean by the term base? So, simply put, data means raw facts about an entity, about a thing. It could be just a number like 1, 2, 10, 100. It could be a picture of an entity, of an item. It could be a letter, A, B, Z. It could be a symbol. For example, an ampersand. It could be a dollar sign, any symbol. As long as they are not yet processed, that's a data. Now, when we talk about database, this refers to a place where data is collected and stored. That's what we mean by a database, a place where data is stored or collected. Now, looking at the picture here, you can see it's an electronic storage of data. So this could be an image of a data center with databases all fixed all around it here. So that's called a database. So data means raw facts which are yet to be processed. And the database is data, a place where data is collected and stored. Now, when these raw facts are processed, we get information. This information normally is stored in files, and files again are collected together and stored in a database. Therefore, data are unorganized, data are unprocessed, data are raw facts, while information is processed data. Now, for example, we could have students marks as raw data, just 50%, 30%, 40%, 50%, 100%. But that's raw facts. Now, when you process that and you say 20% have passed, 30% have an average mark, 1% failed, now that becomes information. Therefore, now let's move on to computer files. What do you mean by this term, computer files? Now, a file basically is a collection of related data or information that is maintained on a secondary storage device. This is the meaning of a computer file. That it's a collection of data which is stored on a secondary storage device, not a primary storage device. There's a difference between primary storage device and a secondary storage device. I believe by now you know what the difference is. For example, a secondary storage device could have things like flash disk, CD-ROM, DVD-ROMs, etc. Now, what's the reason of having this file? this secondary storage file, this computer file. Mainly, the purpose is to have a convenient location where they can be located and retrieved whenever needed. Therefore, computer files are a retention of data that facilitate rapid and convenient storage and retrieval of data and information. Now, we have two different types of computer files. These are classified according to the way the files are used in the information system. We have the master files, and we also have the transaction files. So let's look at these files. Now, a master file has information that is supposed to be retained over a relatively, the key word is relatively, long period of time. That's the master file. For example, when you are registering for your MBA, you did some entering of information, of data into the forms. Now, that information, some of them will be retained over a relatively long period of time. For example, if you come after 10 years after graduation from AUC, you still get your information, your data still stored. So relatively long time period means some can have 5 years, some can be stored for 10 years, some can be stored for 100 years. That type of information is stored in a master file. For example, your date of birth, your results, the grade you got, even in primary, even in secondary, even at your undergraduate, you may find that they are still existing somewhere, should you lose any of your transcripts or your certificates. So that's what we mean by master file. This is the file that retains information over a relatively long time period. Now let's look at another example in accounting and business. Now, an account receivable is maintained by companies that sell to customers on credit. Most of these big businesses, they do business on credit. So they have an account called accounts receivable file. Now, this holds the records like account number of the customer name, address, credit limit amount, etc. This information is retained for quite a long period of time because it is assumed that your customer will stay with the business for quite a long time. Now, this file is usually updated each time the customer makes a purchase, but the customer name remains the same, the address remains the same, but the purchase may change from time to time. So it's updated by a different information from a different file. When a new purchase is made, for example, a new account balance is computed and is compared with the credit limit. If the balance exceeds the limit, then a report is made or issued and unnecessary action is taken. So this is a master file. It has information that retains, it is a file that retains information for quite a long period of time. Now, how do we update these master files? Now, here is where we come to the different type of file. It's called transaction files. Now, this file contains records reflecting current business activities, daily business activities. Now, it's from this record that we update the master file. Now, to continue with our example, The records containing data on the orders of the customer, on the products that the customer has offered, on the prices, are entered into the transaction file. Now these files are then processed and are used to update the master file. Let's take an example of a university. We may have first years. When you join, we have first years. You have your records that will be kept for quite a long period of time in the master file. But there are some records that will be kept in the transaction file. For example, when you do your CATs and you do your exams, first semester exams, they'll be stored on a transaction file and then updated in the master file. When you move to second semester, it will be put on a transaction file, but eventually you'll have your transcript at the end of the year on a permanent on a master file, or transferring transaction data to the master file is known as posting. So when you post, that means you transfer data from transaction files to the master file. Now let's look at how these files are organized. Now files need to be properly arranged, to be properly organized in order to help or to facilitate easy access and of course easy retrieval of that information. Now these files can be organized into serial organization, into sequential organization, into indexed sequential organization, and also random organization. Now a serial organization, this simply means that a file or information is organized information is organized serially, which means one after the other. Record 1, record 2, record 3, record 4, etc. That's serially. Record A, record B, record C, etc. Sequential also means one after the other, but using some kind of identification. For example, we could say January in that sequence, from the first to the last, or from the highest to the lowest, or from that kind of arrangement. As long as there's some sequence, there's some kind of formula used, some kind of methodology used. For example, it could be geographical location, it could be the size, it could be the classes, it could be the position. As long as there's some kind of sequence, then we say that the file is organized sequentially. Then we could have index sequential, which means there's some kind of index put on the file and then there's some sequence being followed. And then you have random. Random is just from any point. You will start from any point. That's called random organization. Now let's look at each of the examples of file organizations. Now, in this serial organization, each record is placed in turn in the next available storage space. That's serial. Each record is placed in turn in the next available storage space. For example, if it's a file containing songs, we would have song number 1, song number 1, song number 2, song number 3, etc. This means that for you to play song number 4, you must access song number 1 first before you go to song number 2 or song number 3. You cannot access directly song number 5 before playing song number 1. That means the files are arranged serially. Then let's look at sequential organization of the file. Now, in this case, the records are organized in ascending sequence or descending sequence, depending on a certain key or a certain formula. Now, these sequential files are accessed sequentially, one record after the next. That means if it's January file, then we have to move January file before we move to the February file, before we move to the March file, etc. Now, this type of sequential organization is basically good for master files, typically in a batch processing environment, where you collect a cohort and then you process. You collect a cohort and then you process. For example, we can collect all the payments in January and then we process them together as a batch. Then in February, we collect them and then we process them together as a batch. So this type of sequential organization is usually important and is suitable for master files. Now let's look at the problems of the traditional file-based system. This is where we use non-electronic form of system. We use the normal files that and folders. Now, each function in most organizations develop specific applications in isolation from other division. For example, before the DBMS at AUC, we had different divisions. We have academic division, we have finance division, and then from there again they are split down. So you find that each and every office has records for students. When you go to finance, you find your file is existing there. When you find to student registration office, you find that your file is there. When you move to the exam office, you find that your file is also appearing there. So there's a lot of duplication and repetition of files. This brings the issue of data redundancy. There is too much copying of the same thing in all the offices. Now, this redundancy leads to inconsistencies in data representation. For example, you may find that in one office where your file resides, you find that your marks could be blank, or your fee is recorded as paid, yet you find that in a different office, the file is not yet updated. So it reads that you have a balance. So that's why you're saying redundancy leads to inconsistencies. Then another problem of traditional is that the program is data dependent. This filing system is data dependent, which means there's a tight relationship between the data files and the specific programs used to maintain them. Now,